but it stays there, right? Like it's, yeah, okay, good.
Next slide. Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you've had a good lunch break. I'm very delighted that we now have a panel on climate and environment. I think the topic couldn't be more timely, and we couldn't be in a more fitting place than here in Brazil to talk about this, as all eyes are on the upcoming COP negotiations next week in Belém. At the same time, I think it's a very difficult time for climate, as leaders such as Brazil are stepping up and pushing new ideas on how to govern climate and the environment. We see others are becoming more obstructionist and trying to reverse goals. And this is something we see especially coming from so-called Western countries, with President Trump stepping back again from UNFCCC agreements, but also in Europe with the rise of more right-wing populism, increasingly a retreat from goals that have been entrenched, and questions about the Green Deal that has been put in place. So I'm very delighted we have an excellent panel here that is going to enlighten us about what's going on in the world of climate and environment and global governance. I'm delighted to introduce the speakers. To my right, we have Carlos Minani. He is a full professor of international relations at the Institute of Social and Political Studies at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. He holds a PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and he completed postdoctoral studies at the Federal University of Bahia, Sciences Po Paris, and the University of California in Berkeley. His main research interests include climate change and international politics, but he has a much broader range of research interests, including international development cooperation, South-South relations, comparative foreign policy, human rights, and global justice. To my left, we have Mihaela Papa. She is the director for research and principal research scientist at MIT, where she is leading the BRICS Center and the BRICS Policy Lab. Before that, she was a senior fellow at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she co-founded the Rising Power Alliance project and has taught sustainable development diplomacy. Mihaela is covering a broad range of research interests, including the focus on negotiations of the rise of new powers and the transition to sustainability, themes on which he has published widely. And then, last but not least, we have at the right, Andrea Rivera Hoffman. She's an associate professor at the Institute of International Relations here at this university and a collaborating professor at UNILA. She holds a degree in economics from this university, a specialization in international relations from the London School of Economics, and a master's degree in international relations from here, as well as a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Tübingen, where she has also been a visiting researcher in many institutions across the world, including Frankfurt, but also the UNU CRIST. Her research interests also encompass a quite broad range of topics, including legitimacy and democracy in international politics, global governance, international organizations and multilateralism, comparative regionalism with a focus on Latin America and Europe, and interregional relations, especially between Latin America and Europe. With that being said, I think we have an excellent panel, and we go in the order of the program, which is going to be Carlos first. And you have 15 minutes, and I'm going to raise the card when you have 5 minutes.
Is this one?
No,
Is this one? Yes, it is. Well, thanks a lot for the very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with my colleagues at this panel. It's very nice to see many faces whom I know, many others whom I don't know. I'm going to be speaking from a Brazilian perspective, not only because I'm Brazilian, but also because I'm going to focus on the contributions that may eventually be analyzed and discussed here coming from Brazilian government in terms of its foreign policy, but also from Brazilian civil society and Brazilian scholarly literature, right? All the images that I'm going to show, or yeah, I think that all of them, there's an exception I'm going to mention, they are available, right, for your use and any kind of curiosity that you may have. I have 4 points. Então, excuse me. I'll until it. I was changing here. Yeah, there is a reflection. Good. So this is the outline of my presentation, right? I have just 4 points. Because I took my PhD, my doctoral in France, and over there they always make only 3 points. I always make a statement in terms of making 4 points instead of 3, right? And I'm going to be talking why Brazil is relevant in global environmental and climate affairs. Secondly, I'm going to say a little bit about some of the recent institutional trajectory of Brazilian environmental and climate governance, and some recent turbulences under the former federal administration of President Jair Bolsonaro, which produced very difficult effects and challenges in terms of reconstruction of the governance that was already in place. It's always much easier to deconstruct and destroy, and it's always a hard task to rebuild institutions, particularly in developing countries. The third item that I'm going to be talking about is about, obviously, crop in the land and some global and challenges and regional and national challenges. And finally, I'm going to conclude with what I see in a nutshell, just kicking off for the debate, some of the contributions that I would see from a Brazilian perspective to multilateralism coming from government, civil society, and scholarly literature. Next, please. So, introduction, I can see. So, as you may know, Brazil is extremely relevant in its own region in terms of environment and climate, not only because it hosts more than 60% of the Pan-Amazon rainforest in its own territory. The Amazon rainforest corresponds to approximately 50% of our territory, which is quite relevant to remember. But Brazil is also at the top of the 17 mega diverse countries in terms of biodiversity. We have a very strong civil society in terms of reframing environmentalism coming from the global north and putting forward our own visions in terms of what we call here in Latin America and in Brazil in particular, social environmentalism, bringing all the claims around environmental justice to the broader framework of social environmental justice. And one of the hypotheses that I have is that our climate agenda is also going to be, we are now seeing some divides, right? But my bet, which is a word here in Brazil currently, my bet is that most probably the climate agenda, at least within civil society organizations and scholarly literature, is going to be very much reframed within this broader framework of social environmentalism. I'm going to be saying some words on that too, right? So my argument here is that all the institutions and all the challenges around the institutions that we have been able to build on environmental and climate governance, they are the result of a very vibrant civil society and strong science community that are key to understand the development of these institutions here in Brazil. Right? And of course, because we had a breach in terms of democracy development and political development with the administration of Jair Bolsonaro between 2019 and 2022, and because it consolidated the organization of far-right movements and leadership here in Brazil, this doesn't mean it didn't exist prior to that federal government, but the actual existence of a federal government with a pen and the pencil and the budget and everything at hand. Of course, this facilitated enormously the consolidation of the far right leadership and movements here in Brazil. Of course, with a strong anti-science, anti-climate, anti-environment, anti-whatever you may think of political banners as part of their political ideology. Very much similar to mirroring to some extent what happens in the States, not exactly the same, of course, but because here I don't have the time to explain too much of the details, mirroring what is happening in the United States of America, right? Of course, with a very strong process of fragilization of environmental institutions and climate obstruction. In spite of the end of this federal administration, many senators, governors, mayors, deputies, federal deputies, local representatives, they belong to this move. And because they belong to this move and because parliaments matter in Brazil, of course, the federal administration currently in Brazil cannot be assessed only through the eyes of the power of the executive branch, but also through the eyes of the necessary conversations, sometimes not necessarily conversations, right, and be very diplomatic, between parliament and the executive branch here in Brazil. We are far, over the process of a strong presidentialism of coalition, as we used to say, and represent a Brazilian presidential system here in Brazil, right? Now the parliament really matters in terms of approving of law projects and budgets and interfering in the actual implementation of public policies at the federal level. Next. I'm not going to speak about all this due to time constraints, of course, but I'm going to show you some pictures just to give you a nutshell of this idea of how the political economy and the emission profiles, the emission profile of Brazil in terms of greenhouse gas emissions matter for us to understand how the politics of the environmental and climate governance is organized or disorganized here in Brazil, right? Next. First, a nutshell of our national climate greenhouse gas emissions, which is very singular in comparison to the majority. In all G20 countries, Brazil is the only country whose national emissions profile is not dependent on energy and industry sector. It's highly tributary to the contributions of land use, deforestation, and agriculture, which represent, as in a global nutshell, of more than 70 to 75% of our national emissions in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. This is for you to understand, next, how the agricultural sector, I should be more precise and say the agribusiness sector, represents a key actor in terms of making things possible or impossible in terms of climate measures and environmental policies here in Brazil. This is the composition of Brazilian exports. As you can see, primary goods, right, and particularly agricultural goods, also with other primary commodities, they represent a big chunk of our Brazilian exports, right? And so this is extremely important because not only in terms of political economy, next, but also in terms of political power. You can see here the representation of the agribusiness power in the Brazilian Congress. It matters a lot for the sake of approving laws, for approving budgets, and for advancing environmental measures and climate policies or obstructing them, right? So I'm not going to get into the detail, but this picture shows very clearly how there is an increase in terms of political power. And of course, this is related to electoral democracy because all these are representatives who have been elected by our population, right, by the voters. So of course, it is a very delicate balance between what the presidency and the executive branch can actually do and in respect to electoral democracy, what the 5 minutes, what the Brazilian Congress in fact obstructs in terms of advancing these policies and measures. Next, Victoria. Okay. So here is the exception that I was referring to, right? Most countries, in terms of national emissions, they are associated with fossil emissions. Brazil, Indonesia, and some other countries like Democratic Republic of Congo are mostly related to land use. Not only these three countries, but I just give them as examples. Right? Our energy matrix is very clean in terms of power generation. Right? Here you have 2 years, 2012, 2020, in terms of comparing some countries that belong to the G20, not all of them, to give you in a nutshell this comparative advantage that Brazil has in terms of energy transition. But next, but our main climate obstructing actor is actually this one that has advanced its tentacles towards 2 key biomes, which are very important for the preservation of environment, for the preservation and protection of rights of indigenous populations, and for the protection of the rainforest, which is the Amazon biome in the up north, right, where you can see between the 2 states the advancement of the agribusiness, but also at the heart of the Brazilian territory, which is our savanna, which has become, thanks to cooperation with Japan, JICA, in the early 80s, extremely productive for the sake of export of agricultural products, which is our Cerrado, right? I don't have time to advance all this. Next, please. Great, next. I'm not going to talk about the geopolitical and national and challenges related to COP because I don't have time, right? I'm going directly to contributions to multilateralism, right? To conclude, right? And then during the debate, if you want, we can come on. As you know, Brazil has been extremely active diplomatically speaking in the last 2 years. I'm not going back to the 80s or 90s, no time for that, right? Brazil was president of the G20 group in 2024, is president of the BRICS group in 2025, and is president of the COP30 this year, which is starting next Monday. I'm flying to Belém on Saturday. I'm a little bit dynamic because of everything I have in mind and that I still have to solve, right? So I will summarize in a nutshell some key points that I believe are some of the key foreign policy contributions from Brazil, taking into consideration these 3 presidencies. In general, I think that Brazil has, the Brazilian government, I should say, the Brazilian foreign policy officials have realized that democracy can be strong political asset these days due to the backlash of democracy in many Western societies and due to the uprise of authoritarian regimes as key global players and due also to the relative backlash of democracy in India. So when we look around, we don't see lots of vibrant electoral democracies and vibrant democracies in many places. So Brazil has led the initiative of the Democracy Always Forum under the UN General Assembly with the strong support of other countries like Spain, Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay. And it has held some sessions, right, for the last 2 years. In the last one, you may have read in newspapers that, can I continue or should I stop? This time. I don't want to bite on the...
Yeah, I think you can get a little bit more time.
Okay, thank you. And Washington was not invited, right? Which is extremely interesting in terms of how democracy is positioned geopolitically these countries, right? And as you know, Brazil is under strong tariffs by the US. So it had all the interest to invite Trump and everyone to this forum, but it decided not to invite Washington to this forum. So one of my hypothesis is that Brazil is trying to use democracy as a political asset internationally, right? And the second element or evidence that I could find in order to support this hypothesis, right? It's a hypothesis to discussion, right? Is the strong support that Brazil is giving to, at the very first time in a COP, in a climate COP, that we are going to have information integrity about climate science and climate policies as one of the top priority agenda items. As Lula would have said, never in history the climate COPs have supported information integrity as one of the agenda items, right? This is actually the first time, with strong support from civil society, from climate action against disinformation networks, Climate Social Science Network at ground, here in Brazil, the Observatory of Information Integrity, directed by Thais Lazeri, and so on and so forth. So this has become a key agenda. And of course, it resonates with what is at stake electorally, domestically, next year, when we are going to have presidential elections again. I'm trying to move, although too rapidly, between the domestic and the international in order to try to convey to you the message that the two levels are interconnected when it comes to defining foreign policy priorities. So under the presidency of COP30, some other elements which I consider important. The proposal to coordinate negotiating tracts between climate change, desertification, biodiversity, and SDGs. I think that we are very much aware of the fact there are too many negotiations going on. They overlap. Not necessarily the same ministries are present, not necessarily the same bureaucracies are present, and we lack institutional memory of what is going on there and here in order to build stronger environmental and climate multilateral organization and negotiations in order to achieve its actual results. Brazil has also supported innovation on climate finance, no time, TFFF, if you want, we can get into the detail, Tropical Forests Forever Fund, and that's the next one, sorry. BOA.
This one?
Yeah. This one, yeah. And the Global Ethical Stocktake, right? So these are innovations that I consider important under the Brazilian presidency. In terms of the BRICS, I know that Michaela is going to be talking about it. I'm not going to say much about it. Climate finance and technical cooperation were both at the heart of the last year's G20 presidency, which entitled Strengthening Global South Cooperation for More Inclusive and Sustainable Governance. Next, it's my last slide. Under the presidency of the G20, sorry, I said the BRICS previously. Under the presidency of the G20, so you have some items, right, like social inclusion and fight against hunger and poverty, bringing social environmentalism together with the agenda of climate, as I was trying to hypothesize beforehand, sustainable development, energy transitions, and climate action, and the reform of global governance institutions. So as you can see, there is a strong support for multilateral organizations. It couldn't be different coming from an intermediate power like Brazil, with a strong tradition of support to multilateral organizations, as in our Brazilian foreign policy. Coming from civil society, I think that COP30 is going to be very different from the last three COPs that we had, particularly due to the active participation of civil society, social movements, and indigenous populations in the land. Minister Sonia Guajajara said that she expects more than 4,000 indigenous peoples, I mean, peoples like persons, right, in the land, not only from the Brazilian territory, but also from the whole Pan-Amazon region in South America. I think that this is going to be different in terms of protests, demos on the streets, and participation within the green and blue zones in the land. The idea of bringing the social environmental agendas closer to climate negotiations. In a nutshell, there is a trend in Brazil to make a bet on green transition based on market mechanisms only. And with the power of corporations, you can assess and analyze if this is greenwashing or not. I'm saying that they are going to, being fossil companies, fund the actual transition towards the renewable energies. I take that as obstruction and as green washing. But there is a dispute which is at the heart of the Brazilian government. Some ministries supporting this green capitalism agenda, and some ministries, less powerful, supporting a more closer dialogue between social environmentalism and the climate agenda. I leave this for the debate. And in terms of scholarly contributions, my last word, I think that there is a strong debate here in Brazil on how to rebuild it and reinforce multilateral organizations from a Southern perspective. Here, I have on my right somebody who has written a lot on that too, right? And also some contributions to the debate on climate obstruction. I put here the cover of the book, which I co-edited with Thomas Roberts, Jennifer Jacob, and Christian Downey on climate obstruction. More than 100 researchers participated in that. It's free for download, so you don't get a penny when you sell it, right? And it's with Oxford University Press. You can see the website. So if you have any questions, please contact me. Here you have my email. And here I left, it's only in Portuguese. So for the time being, it's not yet translated. But if you have any interest, these are publications that we are launching in the LAM next week and the week after during the conference. Thank you so much for your attention and for your comments.
Thanks a lot, Carlos. I think this was a wonderful introduction, also mapping a broad field between climate policy. Thanks a lot for this wonderful introduction and mapping a broad field of like how climate policy is shaped by political economy dynamics, but also this interaction between the foreign policy, the global level, and back to the domestic. We now have Mihaela talking about BRICS as a strategic actor.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm honored to be here and also want to thank Professor Kenkel for inviting me. Actually, Clara mentioned that I was teaching sustainable development diplomacy. And sustainable development diplomacy every year, and I was teaching it for 10 years. Every year I would always start, and this is what happened in Rio. And Rio was the very center of the Earth Summit, of the Earth Summit plus 20. So in a way, like the entire mindset and inspiration was starting from Rio. And this is my very first time in Rio. So I kind of really feel very special here, and that it is a truly special place that changed the history of how we think about sustainable development, how we think about the whole relationship between humans and environment. And I know I don't have much time, so I'm not going to get too excited on that. But I wanted to say a few words today about international climate policy beyond US withdrawal and look at BRICS as a strategic actor. Right now, there are very many major developments in climate diplomacy. I think this was a great introduction, combining like both the domestic and international components. Maybe I can focus more on the international. Of course, there's a question of US retreat, and this time retreat is much different than the last time because the whole negotiation team, that department, is no longer there. So it's not like not being there or being there and not participating. It's really like not having the actual team. With the US now, we have back the debates about the climate science, and at the same time, there is a lot of there are a lot of developments also on the EU front. Right now, there is a 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And I wanted to point that the wonderful Insured report, the team from Insured put together a report that the Paris Agreement turns 10. Is it still delivering on promises? Which actually looks at the history and the current challenges with the EU's own stance and overall in terms of multilateral diplomacy. The challenge for the EU has been that it in a way had to be this system stabilizer in the global climate diplomacy, because it was always between the US and emerging powers in the sense of kind of growing importance. And it in a way had this steady hand, but at the same time, it is currently under fiscal pressures itself. And at the same time, it's very focused on regulation, which means that currently we have CBAM, and last panel mentioned CBAM, but CBAM, the financial implications are starting 2026. So there is a change in scenery there, where the one thing is planning and another thing is the actual financial implications. In that context, the new powers and emerging economies are mobilizing around climate change, which raises questions about, can they converge among themselves? Can they converge in their policies? But also, do they have leverage toward others? At the same time, what are the policy opportunities? It's not just that they're there, but like, are there any pathways that we have not seen before that open more room for negotiation and kind of take us to a new era? I wanted to focus on the BRICS group, and the reason for that is that the BRICS group was initially established to be this strategic actor to change the system. So it was like, in a way, always like a system reformer. And BRICS itself, when it was established in 2009, then South Africa was invited. And the idea has always been that they are the critical mass to change the system, and that they could be built up as critical mass that can actually change how the system we know operates. And then when we look back at the resolution, initial one, when they were BRIC, the stated mission was that they wanted more democratic and just multipolar world order. They wanted to reform global institutions, especially economic and financial. And there was always this pressure, let's diversify leadership, let's become bigger leaders and let's diversify leadership. But at the same time, they also emphasized that they want to serve emerging economies and developing countries. So BRICS today is very different, both in terms of membership, in terms of size. We did a project of mapping enlargement, not only looking at what are the current members and partners, but also who is on the waiting list and who is somehow involved in cooperation. So who are the officials interested and who is somehow involved. So we put that as debating, because they might be involved in one part of cooperation and not really wanting to go in full time. Next one. But with that, the entire setup of BRICS during the years was more that, yes, we want to change the system and we want to diversify leadership. We want more leadership as themselves as BRICS. But in climate, the leadership setup was really fine. It was just that these countries that were supposed to be leaders were not doing enough. So it wasn't like how to diversify leadership, but it was more how to actually consolidate leadership with those who are supposed to lead under the initial setup of the agreements. So in that sense, climate is kind of a paradox out of the fields in global governance in terms of understanding leadership. What happened is, especially in the last 2 years, were two things. On the supply side, once BRICS enlarged, the contribution to the problem has changed. So, for example, if we now map absolute emissions, BRICS has more than 52% of emissions, and that's absolute. So, and on the demand side, BRICS has also changed because there are new initiatives. Overall, the expansion actually changed the emissions mix, policy priorities, but also the negotiation dynamics. So especially when we look at like who are the members that BRICS added, like if we look at, for example, Iran, UAE, looking at some partners. Next. So the question is, can BRICS actually emerge as a climate coalition? And this COP is a very good test whether it can. When we were looking at data on how BRICS policies on climate look like, whether they even have the policies at the group level, we have this BRICS Convergence Index, and we have this indicator that is actually a BRICS level policy harmonization. And then we were measuring policy output on specific policy issue, which was climate here, and coded different ranges of output. So for example, if there is only like one statement in leaders declaration, that would be like, of course, like small number. And if that was like a formal organization institution, that would be a large number. So when we look at like BRICS cooperation here, we looked at 2009 to 2021. We could see that basically BRICS was very low in terms of policy harmonization on climate change. And actually, the text in BRICS declarations that refer to climate change was quite weak. So for example, before the Paris Agreement, there was this text, strengthen global action on climate change through UN negotiations and create a binding agreement. And of course, every declaration had support for common but differentiated responsibilities principle. But then, of course, the question was raised whether, I mean, can BRICS even be cohesive? Because even then, like, this was very vague statement. These were vague statements. But then now, of course, it has like so many more members. So when we think about BRICS as a strategic actor, that's of course a big question mark. Next slide, please. Another challenge in climate is that for a long period of time, BRICS countries have been negotiating in parallel groups. So there was no like BRICS joint voice, but there was actually there has been basic climate coalition. And they would come up with a ministerial joint statement of on climate change. So only when we look at last year, 2024, we can see actually this change, that there is much more consolidation of climate action within BRICS itself, and that there are efforts to institutionalize climate cooperation. So in 2024, there was a decision to establish contact group on climate change and sustainable development, MOU on the BRICS Carbon Markets Partnership, and efforts to establish BRICS Climate Research Platform. So what's interesting, at the very same time, the basics of the group BRICS minus Russia had a very similar agenda, enhanced coordination at UNFCCC, leverage scientific and academic dialogue, and expand joint action on sustainable development. So there is this like parallel tracking of basic and BRICS. Next slide, please. What's interesting about Brazil is that there is the first time the framing of climate leadership, that there is actually an actual statement of climate leadership, BRICS climate leadership agenda. And when we look at the framing of the overall BRICS cooperation, I love this. So Amorim, Lula's chief advisor, saying that BRICS is the new name for development. And even if we look at just the visual imagery, BRICS is embedded in green. So there is much more of a sustainable development vibe with the BRICS. Next slide. So the question, is there new climate thinking? So what is shaping the agenda? Of course, the pressures, trade pressures from the US and EU are really bringing BRICS together in a way. Questions about SDGs future are also prominent. Then the effort to, through BRICS business, to build clean tech and green industrial policies. And there is a lot of effort on carbon markets in different BRICS countries. But the question that remains is, what is the impact on climate adaptation and also loss and damage? Next slide, please. I wanted to outline like several areas where I see potential impact. One area is food security. BRICS is currently creating a BRICS grain exchange, and food security is important because when we look at these different BRICS countries there are countries that are at the same time heavily food import dependent and dependent on foreign exchange. So the potential for BRICS is to design an exchange in a way that advances both in terms of moving to local currencies, but also in terms of addressing food insecurity. Next slide, please. Another area is how to make this exchange viable. And when we look at the countries that joined BRICS as partners, they are actually good importers of the grains that BRICS countries, BRICS countries export. Next slide, please. Another area for us to think about is climate solidarity. Common but differentiated responsibilities principle was built in the context of universal effort. But if we look at BRICS as themselves within the group, is there a parallel concept of common but differentiated responsibilities? So to what extent do these countries that are actually most powerful, like China, have the responsibilities toward those who are least powerful, like, for example, Ethiopia or Egypt? And especially when we think about loss and damage, where African countries were the ones championing loss and damage. And we're working on a paper on norm taking, or norm begrudging in the context of loss and damage, and mapping different negotiations on loss and damage and how BRICS countries were behaving over the past decade. Next slide, please. Finally, there's a question of the use of new development bank. And there have been many references to the new BRICS Multilateral Guarantees Initiative, which tries to de-risk strategic investment. And when we are thinking about a new development bank, the question is, to what extent will BRICS rely on it, and what kind of role it could have as potential climate secretariat, climate clearinghouse, and to what extent is that like a mission free from original bank mandate? So here there is, of course, the climate financing mandate. Then there is an issue with carbon accounting principles, but also questions of IP options for enhancing climate change related technology cooperation. Next slide, please. So when we look ahead, there is certainly growing multipolarity in international climate policy. And yes, there are new initiatives, so there are new pathways that can potentially, where BRICS can potentially be a strategic actor, but of course there is a larger cohesion test. Right now in Belém, what BRICS deliver at Belém will test its credibility, and then actually show what will be brought to India's presidency in a month, 2 months. What we are left with is the larger question of institutionalization versus fragmentation of climate governance, and whether we can see some progress either through BRICS itself or at the global level, and to what extent can BRICS leverage partnerships with other organizations that can help shape its agenda and expand it. And I would stop there. Thank you so much. Next slide, please.
Okay. Thank you, Naila, also for being on time. I think this nicely builds on Carlos showing us how Brazil has emerged in the current administration, again, as a leader in climate, and seemingly also bringing the BRICS group possibly more into cohesion on this. Now I'd like to ask Andrea to give her an input segment.
Thank you very much. Actually, we didn't plan that, but I think our presentations are quite complementary, because I moved to South America, Latin America, but mostly South America. And this is sorry, I don't have my computer here, so I have to learn a bit here. So Latin American regionalism, environment, and climate change. And the idea behind this actually has, I'm presenting a book chapter that I just concluded. I can make it available later. And in this work, I'm building on some previous work, but I'm looking at the regional level of governance, and complementary because of that, because I think Carlos was talking about the Brazilian contribution to the multilateral, but focusing mostly on the global level. And BRICS is also a different kind of grouping, but looking at global level negotiations. And here I'm focusing on the regional level of governance, meaning not only, well, we have currently mainly the marine organization is CELAC, but we have in the past several regional organizations. And in this chapter, I start actually simply mapping what in this recent time, like the last decade or so, have countries in Latin America done at the regional level, meaning not only reinforcing commitments that states have anyway at the global level, but some different type of cooperation or initiatives, departing from the concept that in the region you have some specific issues, such as, for instance, even in the case of the Amazon, some basis for regional cooperation instead of only at the global level. And here, in terms of the analytical framework, so I'm looking at climate change, environment and climate change from a perspective of social policies. And the authors and the literature I use, and especially here Bob Deacon, it's a literature that looks at governance as an attempt to fill gaps in as impacted from globalization. So we work with this framework with other policy areas such as health and also education. So how would globalization have a trend to deregulate at the regional level, at the national level? In some areas, it re-regulate at the global level, but what happens with the regional level? Can the regional level bring in some additional elements to re-regulate again, in the case here of environment and climate change? And I work with this concept of policies and politics, looking at them. I'm mapping all the regional organizations and regional institutions in among Latin American countries working on environment and climate change. And here, the interesting is that, of course, I had published already before about the regional organizations. The traditional ones, Mercosur and their community, but I expanded to some other spaces, and I'll talk about them in a while. And in terms of regional policies, I use this mapping, these categories from Bob Deacon that look at social policies through four axes, levels, regulations, rights, distribution mechanisms. I'm sorry, I think this is the Portuguese one. No. Yeah. It's how. So it's the wrong one.
You translate some things.
I have
It's okay. We can follow.
Yeah. Okay. No. Anyway, I do have a full in English, but too late now. So I use those four categories, again, regulations, rights, distribution mechanisms, and technical cooperation, and through the lenses of comparative regionalism. In the sense, I'm mapping all these four categories of social policy. So what these regional policies they have done, and I compare them to see if there are some areas or some special issues on subtopics on climate change and environment that different regional organizations are more willing to do or more actually capable of doing that. And third, I look at the politics, I mean the actors and processes between the creation of those policies in those frames. So next one. Yeah, so in terms of policies, I didn't bring here a map with the organizations, but I looked at CELAC, UNASUR, Mercosur, and the community and PROSUR. What I did, I put here is a map of the biomes, because as Carlos said before, I think there's a lot of focus on the Amazon region, especially when you look at South America, and there is actually, in that sense, a certain demand for the countries sharing this biome to cooperate, not to forget that most of the regional organizations collaborating work on exactly geographic issues like rivers, mountains, and so on. But in fact, in South America, we do have not only the Cerrado, the savanna, that Carlos already mentioned, but also if you look at the south, the Pampas, and you do have the rivers in the Mercosur area between Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil. You do have the La Plata River, and these have been spaces actually, as we'll see, of some cooperation in the past on environment and climate change more recently. So in terms of the regional integration organizations, I'll talk about them in a while after these other two that I added, because when I started doing this research about the traditional organizations, what I saw actually, that's already one of my findings, is that most of them, they actually do refer to the global level. So as we see in a bit, like UNASUR, you have SAMPA, you have a lot of declarations and meetings, and so member states do commit to the Paris Agreement or to the national level. So there was very few actually extra, like different kind of cooperation at the regional level. But then there are two spaces that I added them in this research. One is the so-called Tratado de Cooperação Amazônica, the Amazon Cooperation Treaty, that became a regional organization in '95. And that's a very interesting story because it actually started along the '92 conference, still with the mentality of actually protecting the sovereignty of the Amazon. So despite all this internationalization and commitments of the Brazilian government, and I'm sure Carlos can talk much more about that, Brazilian foreign policy at the time, there was also already at that time a lot of fear of the internationalization of the Amazon as a topic also in terms of intervention and loss of sovereignty. So this organization, the treaty was created already in '75 for similar reasons, but then among the military dictatorships to develop the Amazon. So the concept then at the time was to occupy the region, but also to bring development in very traditional ways. In '94, in '95, that was not the case anymore. There was already the '92 conference, but still it was an attempt for governments in the region to show that they were doing something, that they did not need actually the global level multilateralism, where of course the countries in the region are a minority in the negotiations to do everything. So this institution is quite interesting because actually it did something in the perhaps 5 years or first decade. Then it was a bit overshadowed by other regional organizations, which I'll talk about next, in the sense of cooperation in environment and climate change. But in 2023, when Lula took power after Bolsonaro, and as already Carlos mentioned, there was a huge attempt to have a foreign policy activism, especially in this area, because of the contrast, because Bolsonaro government, not only domestically, but in the case of environment and climate change, was a completely out of the curve, a point out of the curve. And so basically the Brazilian government actionated a lot of mechanisms, and among them the OTCI as well. And as I'll talk a bit later again, it has a very different agenda actually. It has much more updated, we can say, agenda on those matters, which not only brings in elements of climate justice, also indigenous populations or peoples, but also this discussion about climate finance, new mechanisms, and so on. But also it brings cooperation, as you see that observers, the Congo, that are also river basins countries, Congo and Indonesia, and it also has France because of the French Guiana, where it's quite interesting, and cooperation also with the Amazon Fund, which was also one of these big projects that was canceled by Bolsonaro and was reestablished during this government. Sorry? So this organization, and the next one is the SCAZU agreement. What makes me think perhaps of why the Brazilian government has this issue of information as well now. And this is not an organization, a regional organization, but if you remember, some of that in the end, it brings rights. Now the idea of rights to the environment or rights here also to the environment defenders. This is an agreement that was concluded in 2018. So Brazil was pretty out of it during Bolsonaro. That government started in 2019. And it was enforced in 2021. It was negotiated. It is still open. Brazil didn't ratify yet, but it was negotiated in the context of the CEPAL, this Economic Cooperation Organization in Latin America. And it's quite interesting because it has, it's very innovative. It has a pillar of rights. So far, none of these other organizations, even the regional integration organizations, with the except perhaps of Andean Community, because a lot of member states of the Andean Community, they had the constitution reforms. They included a lot of rights of the nature, of the Mother Earth in their constitutions. So since the Andean Community has a dispute settlement mechanism that accepts human rights also cases, we can talk that perhaps the Andean Community has it, but it doesn't happen. No one sends cases to that organization. While the Escazú agreement, I didn't check, but I mean, the expectation is that this agreement, it's an international agreement, so it can be used at the domestic level. So I have a student kind of starting to map that, but we don't have the results yet. And I just want to mention the importance of this agreement because you cannot see very well, but you have this graphic of cumulative killings between 2012 and 22 from this global witness. And the country that has more killings accumulating almost 400 is Colombia, and the second is Brazil. So basically in the Amazon region, it's the countries with this biome have actually the highest level, and also the other one is the level only in 2024. So the tendency is still increasing because, as we know, in the region, there's also a lot of illegal activities like mining, narco traffic, and you have the case that became quite top in the news of Dom and Bruno a couple of years ago. Next. And I also included here because sometimes you tend to forget when you talk about regional organizations that the UN has also two regional bodies, so to speak, but they are more technical. They basically offer technical cooperation, but they collaborate also with the regional organizations to implement agreements. So they don't decide, they are not legislative, but they can also implement decisions taken under other regional organizations. Next one. So going back to the categories, and this is really a summary because we only have I have 5 minutes, I'll go fast. In terms of regulation, I have a table in the next slides, but I'll just summarize here that what I found that in this mapping is that we do have a sense of a change over time. The regional organizations created in the 90s, they do not have actually almost nothing beyond some wording that they support sustainable development. But they are organizations created in the so-called open regionalism. So they basically have free trade as their main agenda. And when they had something, basically was again remit back to the global level. But later organizations such as already UNASUR had a council, but this organization was disintegrated, so to speak. But also PROSUR and CELAC have some commitments, so there are some regulations, but they are not mandatory, not binding. Then what we see is that in terms of rights, as I mentioned, this Escazú agreement has rights. I mentioned already the under community. OTCA has also in its not only in its documents and the declaration from 2023, but also the projects that are already being implemented. So OTCA has projects that are currently being funded by the way, some of these distributed mechanisms, the CAF, FOSEM, and FOPLATA, these are all regional development banks. FOSEM is from Mercosur. CAF was originally from the Andean community, but now it's a broader bank. So these three organization banks, they are funding projects, for instance, from the OTCA, and including, if you can go on the site, you can see that projects that refer to the rights of nature. And I put here Mercosur into brackets because it's quite interesting. It has a mechanism of dispute settlement that was used so far only for trade. But in fact, there's nothing in the words of these mechanisms that doesn't allow countries or other parts to bring cases related to, for instance, human rights or rights based of nature, or the environment-related rights, such as health, because Mercosur has a discussion about a health rights to healthy environment. But in the case of the papeleiras, some now maybe 7 years ago, it was completely blocked. But that's interesting for the lawyers, especially because I mean there's nothing against that. It could be used. And finally, technical cooperation. Most of these organizations, actually, their main activities are in technical cooperation, especially OTCA. Again, there are a lot of projects being implemented on the ground. I didn't list them all here, but also, as I mentioned, the cooperation with the UN through the RCCs. Next one. I'll skip the regulations. There are 4, I think, tables that you can skip. To go to the last slide, which is about policies. And here, I have a lot in common. Actually, I've been reading our accountants research, because when we look at actors in this regionalism, who are the actors who would bring regulations, rights, etc., to these regional organizations? And obviously states, and here I completely agree with what Carlos said, that traditionally we have the very important concept of presidential diplomacy. So when you have presidents, and President Lula has a very strong case in that regard, bringing issues to the agenda of these regional organizations and negotiations, normally we had something happening, as we have now, even in the case of OTCA, and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, in the environment and climate change agenda, what we see more and more is other actors as important. And I would say that during Bolsonaro, that became very clear because of the so-called BBB causes in its government, where you have a very strong in the Congress a caucus of representing the agribusiness, but also the budget, the military, and exactly, and the evangelics as the Bible. So you do have other actors very relevant right now. So to the point that we can really context as presidential diplomacy is the key. We can see rather a struggle between some interests and policy, foreign policy by Lula, like a presidential diplomacy with Celso Amorim as his advisor. Then you still have Itamaraty, then you have the Minister of Environment, then you have the Congress, which in the end has to ratify all these agreements. So you do have much more plurality of actors. And I used it in the paper also this concept of intermestic. To me, there's a para diplomacy, so the diplomacy of other state parts, but also intermestic, meaning that you have cooperation between those actors abroad and domestically. So they lobbies or the collaboration between lobbies, and especially in some sectors such as oil and gas, and I think it relates a lot to what you refer to obstructionism, how you have collaboration between those companies in several countries acting inside the Congress of the other ones. So energy, industrial, oil and gas, mining, and agro. And finally, I think in terms of processes, what I find there, because I had an example, but I probably skipped it. We do have, of course, in these organizations, most parliaments, Mercosur has a parliament. The OTCA, for instance, has this Diálogos Amazônicos, which is a very strong platform for local and indigenous peoples, which, if you're right, even they will be present in Belém. So you do have both. You have participation. UNASUR had a council for these actors to participate, but you see also a lot of informal contestation and resistance. So I would say that is it policy area? As a policy area, it's a very struggle. It's not, there's no consensus. So just to finalize, I think when we talk about this, cooperation or negotiations at the global level, we do have to take into account that the countries are not black boxes. No? It's a bit standard from our theory point of view, but you do have a lot of actors with very different interests, and who are these actors that are on the table in these negotiations, be it the BRICS, be it the EU, actually, that we can talk about the UDR as Ivan, or be it now in Belém. I think it matters a lot because they are very different with very different interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think thinking back to the last panel, you seem to suggest that here regional organizations are defying the trend of becoming possibly less important because everything moves to bilateral or unilateral deals, but in the climate realm, regional organizations seem to be actors that are also advancing their own agendas that doesn't just copy what's happening at the multilateral level and at the state level. So sorry. We have about 40 minutes now for a Q&A. So we do have quite some time, and I would like to immediately open up and bundle questions. I see Matteo first. Do we still have the microphone that's walking around? Oh.
Thank you very much. My name is Matteo Musi. I'm a researcher from the Instituto per Internazionali. Last week, Bill Gates wrote an article regarding climate change, in which he said that climate change is a problem, we all recognize it, but probably in the past year we have a bit exaggerated. giving too much resources to this issue and diverting resources from other fields, like, for example, healthcare, hunger, poverty reduction, and so on. Do you believe that the year has a point, and do you believe that this word will influence at least a bit the discussion at COP, even considering the role played by the Gates Foundation in developing cooperation field?
Thanks. Could you pass on the microphone first to the gentleman behind you?
Okay, hi, I'm Luis. I'm a PhD candidate in the University of Coimbra and a research fellow here at the PUC. I had two questions actually.
Yes.
Okay. My first question is to Carlos Milan. You mentioned about the COP, about what we can expect from the COP and so on. And sometimes I have the feeling that we gave up on international treaties in climate change. When we think critical. When we think about the Paris Agreement, for instance, it has a lot of limitations, as we all know. And because over the years it's difficult to go beyond that. And so my question was, first, have we really given up on doing a new treaty? And if so, what are the alternatives that we have without a new type of international regulation? And my second question is to Mihaela about the BRICS. My research is also about the BRICS, but I focus more on the security part. And in the security part, the BRICS presidency works more in a rotating manner. So the 5 members have the presidency each year. Sometimes the security part of the BRICS, the advancements, they usually happen when India and Russia are in the presidency. Regarding climate change, we also think that this matters. Because if we look, for instance, the past 3 years, last year was in Baku, but in the year before, COP was in Egypt, I think, the United Arab Emirates, or the opposite. But anyway, both are new members of the BRICS. And I think that these new members also pose a challenge to the BRICS to deepen the cooperation in climate, especially because many of them, they are producers of fossil fuels and so on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let's take one more question, which was, I think Hilke was next. Stephen, you're the next one.
Right, you guys from this university. I thought this was a fascinating panel. You guys from this university. Also looking forward to the upcoming COP meeting. Because Michaela very kindly to church report on 10 years since the Paris Agreement screen. We have another report which was written by our colleagues at Gary Leuven in the first half year on reform decision making. And should read the report for yourself, obviously, but the number of things that they target is problematic. It's the quality of state participation. So, how many passes does every delegation get? It's very minimum, but also non-state participation. So I would be curious to hear what Brazil is doing, hosting this COP to increase that. Another thing, what they obviously target is troubles with decision making, both in terms of consensus rule, but also the overloaded agendas, which I think you also refers to as issues that need to be tackled. And the final point, and I think this nicely links to the previous paper, is the sanctity of the common differentiated approach. We heard from on the Chinese position in the World Trade Organization for new things, similar arrangements. They can take with more flexibility. Is this also something perhaps that's interesting? So we're very curious to hear how particular Brazil, this leadership is approaching the way that meetings make decisions.
Thank you. Let's take these questions and let's maybe go in the reverse order of presentation. So Andrea, you get to pick the questions you want to answer, and whatever is left will end up with you in the end.
No, I'll make a comment about the international treaties because, wait, what's that? Because I think we talked about that in the first panel, as in terms of how to move forward from the current crisis of multilateralism and the role of formal and treaties, but also all those like regulations and so on. I talked a lot about those formal actually instruments and mechanisms. And so you asked about that in the global level, obviously, but I just gave an example that at the regional level, there's some actually enthusiasm about that. And I would say that only because you do have a strong civil society or social movements in the region that are very active in this, even like there is a coalition like to make pressure on the Brazilian government to ratify this kind of agreement. So I think you do see that for some issues. So again, I think there's one example that despite the overall move against formalities and formal institutions, you do have that. And then I think that's related also just to the civil society. But my impression is that, especially for someone working with regionalism, that civil society was pretty much after the so-called wave of the pink tide, where there's a lot of participation, a lot of activism, was a big put backwards in terms of their disposition to act beyond states. I would say that the civil societies are also pretty much on the resistance side of the domestic level, certainly in the case of Brazil. And I would say definitely Argentina, and you mentioned Chile is one of the democratic coalition, but we know that next elections, it won't be even like the traditional far right, but the radical far right. I mean, you have even invented now new labels to classify all this movement with Kaiser. So we do have, I think, a lot of effort being put also at the domestic side. I just want to bring that to see if you agree, because you do have selected issues. I think for that schedule agreement, it was effective. It was a very big scandal also, a lot of series of also assassinations. Thank you.
Thank you. You're next.
I can probably take on the Bill Gates question. So I actually read that Bill Gates statement. It was quite a bit of debate in the US on that. First of all, I give respect to Bill Gates because when you are with so much money like he has, you can always choose to invest in like polluting activities. And he has chosen throughout his life to invest in contributing to global public goods. So he's a private actor, he's a philanthropist, and he's looking at it in terms of his own giving and where he wants to give. And he came to these conclusions that his own giving is best used in the health area, which he's passionate about. That being said, I think what I find not as productive with his statement is that he is framing this as a zero-sum game. And when we think about climate diplomacy before, climate diplomacy, even like when there was a debate whether to talk about carbon budget and whether UNFCCC, like during negotiations, to put out the carbon budget and say, oh, this is what is used and this is what is left, that would be a really non-productive. So now saying that, oh, you shouldn't give to climate and you should give to health, I mean, he didn't say that bluntly, but like, even insinuating that there is a zero-sum game, especially given how closely linked climate impacts are on health vectors, I don't think it takes the debate in the right space. At the same time, what I'm worried about when I read his case, there is a lot of emphasis on climate mitigation. Climate mitigation, when you look at overall climate flows, is not as threatened, and it has been really doing well. Of course, there needs to be more and so on. But it is actually the climate adaptation part that's problematic because of climate adaptation flows that have not been doing well, that have fallen and are like far, like the climate adaptation in Africa, it's far from where it's supposed to be. So I think on that front, the question is like, to what extent what can climate adaptation be supported and survive? And just to take on the question of new members and producers, I completely agree with you. That's a key point, that they have these new producers, but at the same time, some of them, like UAE, is very interested in loss and damage agenda and supporting it. So yes, the new members in a way ruffle the feathers of the current of the old dynamic, but also can bring in new ideas and new ways of looking at things and new sub coalitions if they're championing a certain part of the agenda. And at the same time, I don't necessarily think that there would be this whole climate leadership agenda unless there was as much pressure on them being now 52% emissions. And yes, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I think that leaves business questions for you, and feel free to come in on the others.
Thank you so much for the questions and comments. It's working, is it? Yes. But I'll start with a question myself to Andrea, and then she can answer later on. We didn't take into account the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the court into account, and it has had a very important impact before the Hague court recognizing the rights to environment and climate stability as a human right. And I think that this is extremely important because it really concerns our region. Although it is inter-American, it could be called, in fact, Latin America, right? Because it's only to us, not to the North America. And I was curious to know why you didn't take that one into account too. And referring to Bill Gates, I totally agree with Michaela, right? And I think that it's really interesting. I would take this as an indicator of the relevance and the emergency of the issue. Because when an agent like Bill Gates comes up with such an affirmation, with such an assertion, I think it is, I would be less diplomatic than Ella. I think it's absolutely scandalous due to the high level of consensus that we have in the science community that the action is emergent and it should be taken immediately and not in the coming years. In a very recent paper put forward by the Climate Social Science Network, it was published 2 days before, right? And this is a very, very recent primer written by Sarah Thompson from Université Libre de Bruxelles. And she says that she compilates, she builds a kind of a typology of climate obstruction in the UNFCCC. Right? And one of the typologies refers to divert attention, and another one is to advance non-transformative solutions. And I think that Bill Gates is more or less playing that kind of game, which is very, indicative of the emergency of the issue. And because we already have knowledge, sufficient scientific knowledge about the transformative solutions that are at hand. So when he comes with such an assertion, I would just say, well, it's opposite. It's just the opposite. It's extremely important for us to continue the fight for immediate action now, etc. Luis, international treaty. Yes, I think you have a point on that, but I think that it's not only an issue for some actors. I think it's the geopolitical momentum, which is very much against taking global action in terms of collective action now. I think that we don't have that geopolitical momentum currently. But I think that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is when he wrote that report in 2021, our common agenda, I think is, I don't know if I'm making a confusion between the Brundtland report, but I think that's the title, our common agenda. It's a report of the Secretary General, and he proposes institutional reforms in the UN to reinforce environmental and climate institutions, rebuilding UNEP as a stronger institution, as an organization with a stronger capacity to act, putting together different tracks of environmental negotiations that are separate currently. Because one thing is for you to have secretariats of UN conventions or agreements. Another thing is actually to have an organization that is the secretariat of all these different treaties together. I mean, the secretariats can act in a different way, move forward with the agendas in stronger ways, I think. So I think that not all agents and actors have given up this idea, but I think that the power is not yet there to conform to this norm demand, into this norm solution in terms of new institutions. Concerning you, if I got your name correctly, sorry for that. The last question, I think that yes, participation is going to be one of the key different aspects, features of this COP in comparison to the other three for obvious reasons, right? I mean, Azerbaijan, the Emirates, and Egypt. Well, in Brazil, you have strong civil society, social movements, and the region is going to be very much present, not only, but the region is going to be there. And I think that this feature of participation is going to be a positive one. Perhaps I wouldn't say the only one, but I think that the Brazilian government is smartly investing into that because it's not very costly. And it boosts its own campaign for next year elections too, of course, showing this strong participation of civil society and social movements in the land. Yes, the agenda is very loaded. There are many negotiators who have been complaining about the fragmentation. When you see the agenda items, it is amazing. Everybody is there, but we lose picture of the big transformation that is necessary to take place. And I think that this has to do with the institutional design about which Luis was talking, right? Because I think that this institutional design of COPs, it has served its ends. I think it has produced good results so far, but not enough, not sufficiently. And I think that to move beyond, to respond to what is really at stake, we need another institutional design. I think it cannot be responded by different COPs, Cartagena with biodiversity. It's not like that anymore. I think you have to put things together. And perhaps it's not, I think, at our horizon, institutionally speaking, politically speaking, but I think it will be a need for countries and states and leaders to think of a new, stronger environmental, a broader sense of environmental organization within the UN. I know that the countries, they don't want to spend more money with that, but I think that that's going to be a need. I think there's not another solution instead of that. That's not.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for another round of questions. I saw that Stephen already had his hand up.
Thanks, Clara. In fact, my question relates to the synopsis that you made at the very end of the presentations. The European Union has actually prided itself for its kind of leadership role. Yesterday, it slow walked its own targets 2040. Of course, but takes to shine somewhat of its armor. From a Brazilian point of view, but also in particular the Brazilian negotiator position. There are several avenues, of course, to try and strike up an arrangement with Europe or the EU to create a multiplier effect on various topics that are under discussion at the public. From a Brazilian point of view, Carlos, would that be primarily tracked through bilateralism or Brazil-EU? Would it rather be at a regional South American level, Andrea? I noticed that the CELAC EU summit was downgraded under pressure from Trump, with several heads of state and the European Commission president no longer attending. Or would it be through the BRICS, referring to Michaela's picture also of the map of the world, which suggests that almost half the countries in the world have some form of affiliation with the BRICS. It was too quick for me to spot any European countries. But it would be good to see it again. But so which of those channels, do you think would Brazilian negotiator she used to optimize, chances for success.
Thank you. Are there more questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Victor. I'm the Chief of Maastricht. My question has to start with a bit of an admission. It's not smart to single yourself out of the room, but I'll have to for this question. Namely, I'm a lawyer by training, and like the majority of you. And many of my mentor law colleagues were very excited this past year, particularly in Europe. There were significant developments. We've had quite a few interesting judicial decisions coming in Europe, and the Matzing decision against Switzerland. And of course, coming on the back of that in July, the ICJ handing down its advisory. And my question is just, I always worry that we as lawyers get way too excited about these kind of decisions and what they need, whether maybe perhaps both from your academic expertise, whether you could reflect on, are these so important as we think that they are, and perhaps also from the regional perspective, maybe the Latin American perspective, and these developments.
Any other questions in the audience? If not, I may sneak in a question myself. I'm interested, what do you see as the avenues that work best for actors that do want to advance more governance that is in favor of protecting climate and the environment? It seemed that some of you mentioned civil society actors emerging as pretty important in pushing for that agenda. But I also wanted to tie this question to it to ask about private sector interest. Where do you see private sector interest in Brazil, in the BRICS, in the region going? Are there obstructionists, or is the green transition embedded enough in what they are doing that you also see the private sector as a potential actor pushing for more governance in favor of climate and the environment? Okay, so maybe this time we go the other way around. So we start in the order of the original presentations, and that means Carlos, you would be first.
Thanks a lot. I'm just writing down your questions and still writing it down. Okay. Stephen's question. Well, I think that would be my bet. The Brazilian diplomacy is going to try to play as many chessboards as it can, right? And because there are veto players. For example, when it comes to the region, Brazil is struggling in between Argentina on the one very right side and Venezuela on the other very left side, and trying to be quite in the middle, in between the two. It hasn't been extremely easy for Brazilian diplomacy in the field of environment, climate, and other fields too. Right? Now, Lula has just announced that he's going to be in Colombia for the meeting on Venezuela, right? As a direct response to the Washington's foreign policy for the region, right? Which is very, extremely violent, not only symbolically, but materially speaking. And so I think that this is going to be a moving chessboard informed by systemic variables, but also by domestic variables. And in Brazil, this defense of sovereignty, defense of the Brazilian interests, it brings votes. Right, it does bring vote. So as Trump perhaps has been not only variable, of course, but an important variable to understand elections in Canada and Australia, perhaps he can help us to avoid the return of the far right to the federal administration in Brazil. So perhaps Companheiro Trump can also play a role in that, right? That would be my bet. Right? But of course, I think that Andrea has many more analysis on that than into the region. On the judicial decisions, I studied law myself too, right? So don't feel lonely, right? But then I moved into political science and the master's and PhD, right? But I think that yes, judicial decisions matter a lot, particularly in the field of climate. Climate litigation, answering to Clara's question too, is yet another branch of active positioning of civil society, political public organizations that go to courts in order to make these decisions, these norms, actually be real on the ground, right? And not only domestic courts, but international courts too, right? And it takes a long time, of course. It's not a very smooth process. You're a lawyer, you know that it takes a long time, but it can be effective in the long run. And in terms of climate litigation, you know, you have two big databases worldwide, the Sabin Center in Colombia, and at LSE, you have another one. It's amazing because the two are run by Brazilian researchers. And here at PUC, you have the JUMA, right, which is another group database, which I think it's even richer because it's very much focused on Brazil. So the cases about Brazilian climate litigation are increasing to the extent that Brazil is now number 2 in the world in terms of climate litigation cases, right? The bad novelty is that it has also included now litigation against climate policies, because climate litigation does not mean, I mean, ipso facto, that it is only pro-public policies in the field of climate. And now in Brazil, this database includes also some new cases of not activists, but obstructors trying to oppose climate policies. And I think that that's another avenue for action. I could say a few words, but only later on if we have time, about the private sector. I think this is a tricky field here in Brazil. I'll just end with a quote from about Petrobras. Petrobras says that it is funding energy transition in Brazil through oil development. Well, I have my doubts about that. And in terms of statistics, it's not Petrobras who is the big investment in energy, in renewable energies here in Brazil. It's BNDES, right? So it's our National Social and Economic Development Bank, which is the main investor in renewables. But Petrobras very often, the presidency of Petrobras very often makes public statements in that direction. And I would be very cautious. I think that we need to monitor, to analyze, to do research on that. Some private actors may be engaged, for example, in the field of low carbon agriculture in Brazil, which is really a need. Brazil is an agricultural power. And if Brazil wants to be a leader in climate, it has to be a leader in low agriculture, low carbon agriculture, of course. There are memoranda of understanding with Japan, with China, with India, which have already been signed in order to transfer technology and help Brazilian public company called Embrapa to develop within agribusiness technology and support, technical cooperation support to move towards a new path of agriculture production in Brazil, which should be low carbon intensive.
Thanks a lot. Mihaela?
Thank you. So, which channels I see as promising? One channel is cities and engaging more cities, because when you look at how cities are clustered and how you can address city emissions, that's really important, because you have a very specified geographic area with lots of emissions. And another area that I see promising is the AI and climate agenda, and that's something that Brazil has been pursuing, because when you look at AI revolution, some of the progress done in terms of climate change, like AI revolution is very environmentally intensive. So understanding how, to build data centers that are more sustainable, how to advance different aspects that are needed for AI development, that's really important. In terms of the legal documents, I think ICJ was normatively important to clarify what the obligations are, how to think about obligations, because the text in the treaty is so vague. So you do need some follow-up to that. But that being said, once you have it as a legal document, it's not really that usable to most of the population. So what I saw recently, there was a like how to use ICJ in diplomacy like guide, which So I think the way to use these documents is to actually have somebody who knows how to translate it into like normal people language and how it can play out in real negotiations. Because otherwise, if you just say like, oh yeah, I'll go to the website of the ICJ and read the statement, it's not really taking you to the policy influence and policymakers influence. So finally, on the question of private sector interest, one thing that I noticed within BRICS, there has been a lot of emphasis on resisting green protectionism throughout the evolution of BRICS. That was like one major theme. Whenever you speak about environment, no green protectionism. But at the same time, when you look at the BRICS Business Council discussions and kind of the energy agenda discussions, there is much more emphasis on renewable energy and, for example, more this like solar alliance, Chinese electric vehicles, thinking now about links between trade and environment, trade and sustainable development within BRICS. So almost like to what extent can BRICS be designed for helping green trade and green industrial policies. So I have seen this switch in terms of thinking and debates over probably like over the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Andrea.
Yeah, I'll also get a couple of questions, but maybe I wanted to make a comment that I think we are discussing environment and climate, almost trying to forget about the geopolitics. Now we are talking about South America, Venezuela, Trump, China. I mean, and maybe that's we are very good on trying to do that, and I think we have to do sometimes. But I just wanted to bring this a little bit back because, in fact, I think that even in this agenda of OTCA now that I was referring to, I think there is a very strong attempt to do that exactly because in that organization there is also a lot of adaptation. There's a lot of technical work about water, fire. I mean, they try to have common plans. If you go to the website, you'll see. But obviously, that was an organization that was almost without a head, such as we had in other regional organizations recently. Now it is a Colombian. So I think it's an example of a policy area, again, that in some moments in time, and I think now until the COP, I think that was a period where a lot of effort also on the Brazilian side to make that work, this organization to overcome all these political issues, because it is a fact that it's there. It's still affecting collaboration in Mercosur, for instance. Even we didn't refer to that, but the CBAM and the UDR is also a point of discussion in the agreement with the EU, for instance, and where then you have sometimes a very disagreement between the current governments of those four countries, where this idea of bilateralization has been openly discussed, even in the elections. Now it became an electoral issue in Uruguay and in Argentina as well. So I think we have, to put that back a little bit, because in truth, not only in terms of the consensus on some areas, but because I think those issues are interlinked. They are interlinked, and that's very clear. For instance, in the case of now that we didn't talk much in the panel of trade, but in fact, CELAC was trying to make a joint attempt to refer not only the trade sanctions, but before that, the prison and the sending, I don't know, of migrants to in the end now Bukele's prison, and CELAC tried to have a common position against that and didn't manage. And I think this is very clear how in that sense the foreign policy of Trump is using these agreements very clearly. On one in the same week, you have a discussion about the sanctions, and then you have also the discussions about the bombing of Venezuelan boats in the Caribbean in the same week. So we cannot really completely kind of shy away all these discussions. And just to make it short, I think that there are these attempts. And again, at the technical level, some of these organizations, they have staff from the national governments who are interested in collaborating, putting on the ground some plans, especially in adaptation, because it's part of their daily life. So I think that the point about cities that we didn't mention much, but it's very important. And we are having here, and I see Luciana there, actually, you're participating in the meetings this week, even here in Rio, among mayors and governors. And I think that's one of the ways. I don't think any of us put that too much frontal, but I think at the local level, it's one of the paths, not the big global level, because these geopolitical issues will be there, but at the local level, maybe not, at least for some issues. And then, so again, I don't think there is a choice here about between bilateral, multilateral. I think we discussed that in the regionalism in the area, that we need to try on all these levels at the moment. But if we have, in the case of TCA, for instance, it's not a problem, because it's not a common union, it doesn't have a common trade agreement, so that's fine. I mean, countries from OTCA can do bilateral negotiations or agreements on cooperation, especially, as I mentioned, also in the case of the Amazon, you do have a collaboration with Guyana, for instance, and that's possible in this organization, but it would be impossible to think about that in other spaces. And then finally, so again, I do think this is related to democracy in the end. I want to make that point, because even in the case of the discussion of the treaties, if it's not democracies, these treaties won't be implemented. Civil society will shy away, like we did have that 4 years ago. And I think if you want to go to the streets, you cannot go. Even if you have a case, you cannot bring. So it all depends on some working institutions at the national level. And so I just took whoever from all those countries also in the BRICS are fine with that, fine. But I think it's impossible to think about climate change and environment without thinking about how this will be on the ground. And this will be people. We do have a lot of, in the case of Brazil, that's very frontal, not very climate justice there, because it's unequal. So if you don't have the possibility for civil society to at least say something, I don't think this will work. I don't think climate change will be really a fight, or the environment sustainable development will take place. So yeah, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did you want to comment on that comment? You were looking a little bit attentively to Andrea. You don't have to. Just we have 2 minutes left.
With the points that you raised. I think, of course, geopolitics is prominent. I think, it was always the question with climate process, like how to preserve the process to be universal. And it was not as much a question how to create the best possible outcome. And then, I'm always wondering to what extent we make trade-offs between process and outcomes. Mm-hmm. And whether, and now with the US completely out, that's again the question, what kind of process do we need? Do we really need like 80,000, 50,000 people on the negotiations? Or do we need really like to focus on the outcomes and what's the quickest way to make the most impactful outcomes?
Carlos?
Yeah, I would just like to jump into Andrea's final comment, because it was my first comment that democracy is a political asset for Brazilian diplomacy. And you can see the list of countries that are part of the Democracy Forever Forum at the UN. You have Chile, you have Uruguay, you have Colombia. And in Europe, you have Spain, you have the UK. So the European countries are not really there, which shows a lot of what is at stake when we say that democracy is really very important for the sake of debating all these subjects, such as climate, social policies, poverty reduction, environmental measures, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a weird world that we are living, because normally Europeans would be preaching democracy on us, right? And now we are preaching democracy on Europeans, which is really something very bizarre from a Latin American perspective.
Okay, thank you all. With this comment, let's conclude this panel. Let's all keep an eye on what's happening in Belém starting next week, and let's give the panelists another round of applause.
Thank you so much for moderating.